Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my August wrap up and telling you about all the things that I read in the month of August. So just before I get into the books, I did want to make a quick little announcement and you know that videos are going to be a little sparse and few and far between for the rest of September. I am about to move. We're leaving this flat and me and my partner Nick are going to be staying with my parents for a little bit between houses. So you might see a new background that is also a very, very old background from my very old videos when I used to make videos when I lived at my parents' house, and then at some point we'll move again and there'll be a new background. So the next few months are probably going to be a little bit scatty and mad anyway, and the next month is going to be very much so. I have been pre-filming a lot of videos for Victober in the last few weeks because I definitely want to make sure I have lots of Victorian content up in Victober because I'm really excited for that, but that has meant that I haven't been able to pre-film anything for September, so I think I have one pre-filmed video to go up next week and then there'll probably be a gap. Basically beyond Victober itself things will probably be a little bit less organised on this channel than I would usually like them to be, but that is fine and we're going to go with it. Anyway, moving on, let me tell you about the things that I read in August. So for all of the reasons that I just mentioned, August was a slightly weird month in that the first half of the month I read a lot, and then in the second half of the month, preparing to move and all of that, I haven't been able to read nearly so much. So I didn't get to a lot of things on my August TBR, and though I have read a lot of books in August, a lot of them were very short and a lot of them I read on that weekend I did where I tried to see how many classics I could read in 24 hours. I'll link that vlog down below. So in August I managed to read 23 and a half books. 5 of them were for work, so there are 18 and a half books I want to tell you about today. Like I said, a lot of these were very short classics, all non-Victorian classics, which was my focus for the month of August, and then there are a couple of contemporary things that I read this month as well. A lot of these were library books that I've now had to give back to the library, so I don't have many books to hold up today, but yeah, let's get into the books. So the first book I want to mention is actually the book that is my half of my 18 and a half, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. I'm listening to this on audiobook. It is 50 hours long and I'm halfway through. I'm really enjoying it though, so I'm hoping I will finish it off in September. The Count of Monte Cristo is a 19th century French classic and it tells the story of a man called Edmond Dante who is falsely imprisoned for being a Bonapartist agent, even though he isn't, and then we follow his life in prison and later his quest for revenge. It is fantastic. I am really, really loving it so far. I understand why it is the favourite novel of a lot of people whose opinions I respect. I'm looking forward to the second half. I feel like I'm barely beginning the story and I'm more than halfway through. It's just so long and intense and there's so much in it, but I really, really adore it. The next book I want to mention is another 19th century French novel, and that is The Hunchback of Notre by Victor Hugo. I actually finished this off in the first few days of September, but I read the bulk of it in August, so gonna count it here. This is an interesting novel. I have read one book by Victor Hugo before, Les Miserables, which I read as a teenager and I absolutely adored, so I was looking forward to this. It's one of the books that has been on my physical TBR for the longest. I don't think I loved it as much as I wanted to. I didn't love it as much as Les Miserables, definitely. It is a historical novel, so it was written in the 19th century, but it is set in the late 15th century, and it tells the story of various characters who are all connected by Notre Dame in Paris. And it looks at these various characters, most of which are not very nice, and all of the links and complexities between them. You might be vaguely familiar with the story from the Disney film. This is not like the Disney film, although actually there's a surprising amount of it that is very similar to the Disney film, with some very, very key differences. There were lots of things that I did like about The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I found it an interesting novel in many ways. I found it very readable, as I do find Victor Hugo surprisingly funny in parts. I really like the character of La Esmeralda. She is a really compelling and interesting character, and I thought the ending of this novel was really compelling. In fact, the last third of the book I really enjoyed, but I did find it quite slow going, and I feel like this book just could have been a third shorter and kept everything about it that was good, which I feel bad saying because I always get annoyed with people for saying that Les Miserables could be shorter and should be shorter, because Les Miserables is probably twice the length of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I felt that it was all needed to be there and it was all perfect and it was all wonderful, and I didn't feel that it was tangential, but I did feel that with The Hunchback of Notre Dame. I do also feel that this slightly suffered from the fact that I am listening to The Count of Monte Cristo on audiobook at the same time as I was reading this, because The Count of Monte Cristo is so good, and they're quite different books in many ways, but they're both 19th century French classics, and I think it was very hard to stop my very high opinion of The Count of Monte Cristo influencing my slightly less high opinion of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and making it less high. So I did really enjoy it, but I didn't love it as much as I was hoping to, but there we go. The next book I want to mention is The Alienist by Machado de Assis. This is a 19th century Brazilian novella about a man who starts a psychiatric hospital in his small town and begins to put more and more people in it as he decides that everyone around him is insane. I really enjoyed this. This was a really interesting, compelling novella. It was very funny and satirical in a really clever, sharp way, and I thought it was a really interesting and intriguing read, so I definitely want to read more by Machado de Assis in the future, and this was a thoroughly enjoyable read, one of my favourites of the month. I also read The Death of Ivan Ilich by Leo Tolstoy. In this Penguin Little Black classic we have the short story The Death of Ivan Ilich and another story called Three Deaths, both of which are about death and about people coming to terms with their imminent death. I really enjoyed both of these stories. I really liked Leo Tolstoy's writing, and it was nice to read something short by him for a change. Previously I have read Anna Karenina and War and Peace, so these were very interesting reads. I also read The Awakening by Kate Chopin. This is a late 19th century American novel that tells the story of a woman kind of coming to terms with her life. She is a fairly young woman, she's married, she has children, and she has basically lived her life in a dream up until this point, doing everything that is conventional and following the conventional patterns of life and what is expected of a woman in late 19th century American society. And then she meets another man, not her husband, and falls slightly in love with him. But it's not about that so much as what that tells her about her life and how she slowly begins to kind of wake up from the dreams she's been living in and understand her life and all the things that she thought were choices which maybe weren't choices. It's so good. I love this so much. This is one of my favourite books of the month, and it was absolutely incredible, and I just absolutely loved it. I love Kate Chopin's writing, but there are some short stories in the back of this book as well which I really enjoyed, and I think the way she writes about the position of women in late 19th century American society and the way she kind of writes this sort of sudden understanding that this woman comes to about her life, it's so powerful. And I just thought the ending and everything that builds up to that was just fantastic, but also the dialogue and the writing and the characterization felt so real and so wonderful. I've definitely already said this in another video, but I feel like The Awakening was what I really hoped Madame Bovary would be, which Madame Bovary failed to be. I read Madame Bovary earlier this year and didn't like it, so I feel like if you've read Madame Bovary, were really excited for it and didn't like it, try The Awakening. Definitely much better. Similar premise in some ways, but oh my goodness, this was incredible. The next book I want to mention is The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Tressel. This is a British classic from 1914. This book is sort of half a story of several working class men who work as house painters in a small town, and it's kind of half a socialist manifesto as well. So although, you know, the characters feel very real and we follow their stories and their lives, there are also several chapters which are kind of speeches from one character to some of the other characters, and it's a real kind of exploration of and championing of early 20th century socialism. This was an incredibly interesting novel that I really enjoyed. It's really compelling and powerful, and the characterization is so good, and I feel like, considering what this book set out to do and how much it is in some ways a socialist manifesto, also all of the characters are really real and do feel really realistic, and I did believe the circumstances and the conversations that these characters have, even though they are there to kind of serve a purpose. There was a lot in this book that I really loved. It is very touching, very sad at points, but it's got this kind of sense of hope running through all the misery as well. Really reminded me of George Gissing's writing, actually, specifically of his book The Netherworld. So if you like George Gissing, I would recommend The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. I'm so glad that I finally got around to reading it, because it's another one that's been on my shelves for a while. It was just a really great read. In August I also read Death in Venice by Thomas Mann, which is a German novella from the 1910s, I believe. This tells a story of an older man who is a failing writer who goes to Venice in order to kind of try and cure his writer's block, and while there he sees and falls in love with a 15-year-old boy who he doesn't speak to, he just kind of watches from a distance and admires, and then cholera comes to Venice and he has to decide whether or not to stay and what he's going to do. It was a really interesting novella. I still don't really know what I thought about it. I'm still kind of processing my thoughts. It definitely was not what I expected it to be. And in some ways I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the writing, but I almost sort of don't know quite what to make of it. But it was a very interesting read and I'm glad I read it. Although I don't think I loved it as much as some of the other things that I read this month, I also feel like it was a really impactful read. And yeah, definitely I want to read more by Thomas Mann later, and I'd like to read some of his longer stuff as well. The next book I want to mention is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is a early 20th century British classic. This was a really interesting read. So I've read one book by Virginia Woolf before, or one of her fiction books I should say. I have also read A Room of One's Own, which I really enjoyed, but I've read her novel To the Lighthouse previously, which I didn't really get on with that well, or I kind of enjoyed it but it didn't really stick with me. But I think I enjoyed Mrs. Dalloway quite a bit more, although it remains to be seen whether or not it will stick with me, I suppose. Mrs. Dalloway tells a story of quite a few characters over the course of 24 hours. Virginia Woolf writes in a sort of stream of consciousness way, so we flick back and forward between characters and in and out of their heads very rapidly. In many ways I really enjoyed this. It was a really interesting and engaging read, and I found that I got more out of the characters and the plot than I had when reading To the Lighthouse. However, I did still find bits of it a bit confusing, and I don't really know what happened in the ending, and I feel like I was supposed to, and I read the last few pages like 3 times and I still didn't feel like I really understood what had happened, or if anything had happened, or if that was the point. I don't know. So I enjoyed it more. I do want to read more Virginia Woolf in the future, but I'm still not fully convinced she's for me. I enjoyed Mrs. Dalloway quite a lot, and I got more out of it than To the Lighthouse, but I still feel like there was something I was missing a bit, if you see what I mean. Next, I want to mention Passing by Nella Larson. Passing is an American novel from the 1920s. This, along with The Awakening by Kate Chopin, is probably my favourite book of the month. I can't really choose between the two, but I love both of them. So Passing tells the story of 2 friends, Irene and Claire. Both Irene and Claire are African American, but they're both fairly pale-skinned, and Claire passes in her everyday life as white. Her husband is white. Her husband does not know that she isn't white, and he is incredibly racist. And as Claire and Irene's friendship is rekindled and they're kind of pulled into each other's lives, and we see all the tensions of this pan out, and Claire's behaviour has a greater impact on Irene's life than she could have ever expected. I really, really loved this. It is very short, but it really, really packs a punch, and the ending is just amazing. Like, the ending was incredible. All of this was really good, but the ending was just completely amazing. This was an amazing novel. It deals so complexly and fantastically with issues of gender and race, and marriage, and like life choices and female friendship, and I just was completely blown away by it. It was so good, and I just absolutely loved this. So yeah, so glad I read this in August. This was fantastic. I also read 2 Agatha Christie novels this month. One was Murder at the Vicarage, which is the first novel that features Miss Marple. So I've read a few other Miss Marples before, but I haven't been reading them in order, so I thought I would go back to the start and begin. And The Murder at the Vicarage, as the title suggests, tells the story of a murder that happens at the vicarage, and of course the vicar's neighbour, Miss Marple, gets involved and to help solve the mystery. I really enjoyed this one. It was a good fun mystery, as Agatha Christie always is. Really compelling, really enjoyable. I love the way she writes characters. And I think I said this before, but the thing that I find so interesting about Agatha Christie is that, having read quite a lot of her books now, she does repeat quite similar mysteries sometimes. Like, I do often read her books and I'm like, oh, this mystery is quite similar to the mystery in that book and that book, but all her characters feel completely unique, which I just don't understand how someone could do who has so many novels and such a massive cast of characters. So really, really enjoyed this. Yeah, believable characters, compelling mystery, and I thoroughly enjoyed it as always. Then I also listened to one of her Poirot novels, Peril at End House, which me and my partner Nick have been listening to together. We're working our way through all of Poirot on audiobook rather slowly, but this month we listened to Peril at End House, which was a really interesting read. I really enjoyed this one. Poirot and Hastings turn up in this small town. There is a woman there known as Nick, who they get to know, and she explains that recently she has had a strange series of accidents occur to her, and then Poirot sees someone try to kill her, and Poirot gets involved in trying to work out who is trying to kill her and to save her life. It's a really interesting Poirot novel. I thoroughly enjoyed it, as I always do with Agatha Christie. Just really, really love her books. Another thing I listened to this month was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This was a really fantastic book, and the audiobook was amazing as well. This is an American novel from the 1930s, and it tells the story of a woman called Janie who has come back to a town where she used to live after years away, and she's telling a friend of hers the story of her life and of her 3 very, very different marriages and her 3 very, very different husbands, and then we follow Janie kind of through her life and through these different relationships. It's a really brilliant novel. I absolutely love the writing. The writing is really stunning, really lyrical and really beautiful in just a truly fantastic way. But I also really love the characterization and the themes of this book. I think the way it explores gender and race in early 20th century America, and I think the way this book looks at marriage and love and relationships and kind of gender power dynamics within marriage was just so interesting. So I highly, highly recommend Their Eyes Were Watching God. It was really fantastic and very, very amazing. An American classic I enjoyed rather a lot less was The Peril by John Steinbeck. This is one of John Steinbeck's novellas, and it tells the story of a man who discovers a very valuable pearl and then how that seems to potentially cause everything to go wrong rather than to go right for him. I didn't really get on with this. This is the second thing I've read by John Steinbeck. I've also read Of Mice and Men, and both of them I sort of found the writing fairly enjoyable, but I found that they just completely didn't have an emotional impact on me, or didn't pack a punch in the way I wanted them to. So I would like to read some of Steinbeck's longer work, because I think maybe I need to give East of Eden a try before I say that he's really not for me, but so far I haven't had much luck with him. Another American classic I read this month was Breakfast at Tiffanys by Truman Capote, which is a mid-20th century American novel, which I really, really loved. I really, really enjoyed this. So the volume I read also had some short stories in the back by Truman Capote, which I really enjoyed as well. But Breakfast at Tiffanys just really blew me away. So we follow a young man, but we're mostly not learning about him, but about his downstairs neighbour, Holly Golightly, who is this kind of socialite in 1940s America, and we're following kind of all the scrapes and troubles that she gets into and her friendship with her upstairs neighbour. I really enjoyed this book. I especially really enjoyed the friendship between the main character isn't named, but Holly calls him Fred, though his name isn't Fred, so I'm just going to call him Fred. The relationship between Holly and Fred I really, really enjoyed and I found really interesting. And it was interesting, so I haven't seen the film of Breakfast at Tiffany's, but I watched the trailer after having read the book, and that is not how I imagined it. That is not the relationship that I imagined. So I don't know if I ever want to watch the film now, because I feel like it had a completely different interpretation of the book than me. But I really enjoyed the book, and I really enjoyed the friendship that I saw between these two characters, which I definitely didn't read as romantic. So anyway, I really liked Breakfast at Tiffany's. I thought it was a really interesting kind of looking back narrative, over the shoulder narrative, had that sort of nostalgic looking back on your youth feel, which I really enjoy in books. And I thought the like complicated friendship between these two figures who slightly feel outside of the world and like they haven't really found their place to belong is something I really enjoyed. Another mid-20th century American novella I read in August was Franny and Zooey by J.D. Salinger. This was another one that I didn't get masses out of. I feel like I was somehow missing something here. I really enjoyed the dialogue and the characterization, but I kind of felt like I got to the end of both the short story and the novella in this feeling like I'd missed the point. So Franny and Zooey are two separate stories. Franny and Zooey. Franny and Zooey are siblings, so they do like get mentions in each other's stories, and it's basically about them as young people struggling with their mental health and struggling with the impact that their elder brother's suicide has had on them. But I believe that Franny and Zooey and their other siblings turn up in other J.D. Salinger stories, so maybe I would have got more out of this if I had have read some of his other work. But I would say that while I enjoyed the dialogue and the writing, I didn't really like massively get on with the stories or feel like they were saying much. I also read Dublin IV by Maeve Binchy in August. Dublin IV is a collection of 4 stories from the late 70s, and these 4 stories are quite separate, but they're all set in Dublin in the same postcode, Dublin IV, and we're following 4 very different people. One of the stories is about a woman who holds a dinner party to which she invites everyone that she knows, including the woman that everyone apart from her knows her husband is having an affair with. One of the stories is about a young girl who moves to Dublin who is kind of feeling really isolated in her new life. One of the stories is about a woman welcoming her husband home from rehab, where he's come having recovered from an alcohol addiction, and we're just following lots of different characters and their different lives, and I just really enjoyed it. I think Maeve Binchy just has a wonderful way of writing dialogue and really captures characters in this really realistic, just perfect way. So really love this. This is the second thing I've read by Maeve Binchy, and I'm sure I will read plenty more by her in the future. Then I also read Beloved by Toni Morrison in the second half of the month, which I really enjoyed. This was a really fantastic book, and I'm so glad that I finally read something by Toni Morrison. Her writing is amazing. I see why she has the reputation that she does, and I definitely want to read more by her in the future. Beloved is a historical novel, so it was written in the 80s, but it is set in the 19th century, and it tells a story of a family who are living in this kind of isolated place, a mother and daughter. The mother is a former slave. She ran away several years ago, and since running away she has brought up her daughter, who is now 18, but this daughter is actually her fourth child. She had two sons who ran away in childhood, and she had another daughter who we know died when she was 2 years old, and there is a tombstone nearby that says nothing but beloved on. So we know from the beginning of the book that both Seth and her daughter Denver feel like the ghost of this dead baby girl haunts the house, and then one day a man turns up from Seth's past, the ghost seems to vanish, and then a few days later a young woman turns up at the house who says her name is Beloved, and everything goes on from there. It's a little bit of a ghost story, but also there's so much else going on as well. I really loved this. It was really incredible. The writing is truly amazing, and I think the themes that Toni Morrison deals with and the way she explores these very complicated characters is really fantastic. Obviously, as I've kind of mentioned, there is a bit of a ghostly element, but also it feels like so realistic in the complicated psychologies of all the characters, and I think the way you slowly learn more about the past and the way that Toni Morrison interweaves the kind of past plot lines and memories of Seth with the current plot lines is something I really enjoyed. So this was a really fantastic read, and I definitely want to read more by Toni Morrison in the future. Finally, I did read two things from the 21st century this month. One is Fire Song by William Nicholson, although I think this is only just from the 21st century. I think this came out in 2002. This is the third book in the Wind on Fire trilogy that me and my partner Nick have been listening to on audiobook for a while, and we finished this off at the beginning of August. So I had read the first book as a child, but I had never read on with the rest of the series, and Nick read them all when he was a kid, so we'd been listening to the series together, and I in some ways really enjoyed this. I think it's a really interesting series as a whole. They're sort of children's fantasy novels, but they're quite like fable-like and dream-like in the way they're told, and the sort of like episodic nature of the books. I can't really explain the premise of the third one because it's gone so far from the first, but it would be spoilers for the earlier ones. But basically through the whole series we're following a family, specifically two siblings, Bo and Kes, who have a sort of telepathic link with each other, and we're kind of following their lives and their family and their kind of quest to build a better world for their people. So there were some things that I really enjoyed about the final book. I think there were some very clever things about the ending, and as always I really enjoyed the writing and the characterization, but there was one thing about the ending that really annoyed me, which I can't really explain, and it wouldn't make any sense unless you read the books anyway, but there was just one thing about like the epilogue basically that just kind of bothered me, which slightly soured the ending that otherwise could have been really good. So I think I have like quite pleasant feelings about the series as a whole, but I just wish one little thing had been different. Then finally I also read The Switch by Beth O'Leary this month, which I read for a book club me and some friends are doing, focusing on commercial women's fiction. So I read The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary last year and really enjoyed it, so it was nice to pick up her second novel. And The Switch tells the story of two very different women, Lainey, who is in her sort of mid to late 20s, and her grandmother Eileen, who is in her late 70s, and both Eileen and Lainey are kind of struggling in their different lives. Lainey has kind of gone through a crisis at work, and we know as well that she is really struggling with grief after the death of her sister a few years before, and since then she's had a very strained relationship with her mother. And meanwhile Eileen, her husband left her last year. She's on her own, getting used to being on her own, and starting to see that maybe she spent so much of her life kind of waiting for her husband to be a man that he was never going to be, that actually she feels like she has lots of life left to live. So Lainey and Eileen decide to swap, and Eileen moves into Lainey's like 20s flat share in London and starts internet dating, and Lainey moves into Eileen's village home and like gets involved in the parish council and stuff. So I'd highly recommend this. It's a great read, and I really enjoyed it. I feel like delightful is the best word to describe the switch. It was really, really lovely. It really complexly and interestingly deals with kind of grief and growing older and complicated family dynamics, but it's also just a really sweet love story that I really, really enjoyed. So definitely one I would recommend and a really good read this month. So there we go. Those are all the books that I read in August. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. And that's it for now. Like I said, videos may be a little bit scatty in the next few weeks, but regardless, I'll be back at some point fairly soon with another bookish video.